Karl Marx's revolution started as class warfare in which he set the proletarians against the bourgeois, with the goal of creating a new proletarian world order. Due to the failure of the proletarian labor unions to bring about communist governments in Western Europe, the Frankfurt School, as well as the American Communist Party, shifted their efforts to mobilize women and minorities into the revolutionary ranks in America. The major advance towards this goal was the nationwide campaign against discrimination that led to a series of laws passed by the U.S. Congress during subsequent years. The Frankfurt School, a group of cultural or transformational Marxists, launched a program of psychological warfare against our American civilization. We need to know what it was and how it was set to work, because the Frankfurt schools were even more successful than the Communist Party in achieving its goals. Gentlemen, I would like to discuss a very important subject, the Frankfurt School. Dr. Nelson, would you tell us exactly and precisely what the Frankfurt School was?
The Frankfurt School was not a school in the traditional sense. It was not a building, although it did start out, it had a building when it began in Frankfurt, Germany. We need to think of it as a school of thought. That is a very important distinction. It was a Marxist experiment that was very, very successful. It started out in Frankfurt, Germany, and that's the origin of its name.
Dr. Nelson, why was the Frankfurt School originated, and what was it set up to accomplish?
The Frankfurt School originated because Marxists in Germany realized that they had a problem. To understand what the problem was, we need to backtrack historically. You recall that Marx published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. In 1867, he published Das Kapital. In the years after these important works were published, the Marxist Party grew among the ranks of the international socialists. The Marxist school grew ever stronger. They looked to predictions that Marx made as to what would happen to the capitalist system. And it seemed at first that there might be some validity to Marx's predictions. He believed there would be what we now call depressions, and there was a depression just a few years after the publication of Das Kapital, when the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed. But something happened that was not according to the historical plan, according to Marx. Capitalism fell down, it crashed, it collapsed, but then it got back up again, and it developed and became stronger than ever. Industrialism developed as it never had before. So that was one prediction that didn't seem to come about. The Marxists were not discouraged, though. They just waited for another and greater collapse of capitalism. What would be its final collapse? The final collapse would bring about the rising of the proletarians. Those were the people who had no property, who lived only by selling their labor. The rise of the proletarians who would bring in the socialist revolution. Another prediction that Marx made was that the middle class would disappear. There would be fewer capitalists, but they'd be richer. The little capitalists, all the little farmers, the little shopkeepers, the little handicraftsmen would disappear. There would be only just a few big monopoly capitalists. That would bring on the crisis of capitalism, because other than a few capitalists, the vast population would be the proletarians, working people who had no property, who had no interest in society, no stake in society, people who had, to use the expression Marx used in the manifesto, nothing to lose but their chains. When the proletarians had finally reached the last desperate stage of historical evolution, they would have no sense of culture. They would not identify with any nation. They would not identify with any religious faith. They would not have any ideals. They would have nothing before them but the realization that they were nothing. They had nothing to lose but their chains, and they would be ready for the revolution. The turn of the century came, and with it the rise of conflict among the great powers in Europe. There was the Great War, what we now know as World War I. The Marxists rejoiced in this because they believed that the proletarians had no reason to be good patriots or to support their respective nations. Why should a French working man or a German working man or an English working man care about the nation? He had no stake in it. He had no identity with it. He had nothing to lose. The Marxists believed that World War I would bring on a great crisis. It would bring on revolution everywhere. World War I did bring on revolution in one nation, Russia. But that was, again, a little bit contrary to Marx's plan. Marx predicted that the most advanced industrial nations, the nations in Western Europe, would go to socialism first. So that was another reversal of Marx's predictions. Also, it was true that by this time, the proletarian class, instead of becoming more poor and more desperate, was actually beginning to become less poor and less desperate. Workers were organizing themselves, and they were making their own bargains in the marketplace. Their material circumstances were actually improving. The middle class was not disappearing the way that Marx said it should disappear. So, Marx's predictions had failed. After World War I, the Marxists in Germany had this great question before them. Why did the workers not do what Marx said they'd do? If they were rational people, realizing they had nothing to lose but their chains, they would have risen up and they would not have supported war. There would have been revolution everywhere throughout industrialized capitalist Europe. But the workers were good patriots, and they rushed to arms. Why was that? The founders of the Frankfurt School, which was established near Frankfurt, Germany, near the University of Frankfurt, realized that too many of Marx's predictions had not gone according to schedule. They had to find a cause. What had caused the predictions not to materialize? There was something irrational, something in the minds of the workers, and this was a big deviation from class.